Hi everyone! So today we're going to be talking about the respiratory system. So we're going to start here with the anatomy. So you can see we've got the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, oral means mouth. So this is where the air can come into the body. We've got the pharynx, which is right here at the back of the throat, the larynx or the voice box, then the air can move down into the trachea. These purple guys here are the lungs. And then we've got the diaphragm, which is a muscle that helps us to breathe underneath. So we're going to start with the nasal cavity, so the nose. It's divided medially by the septum, right? We have a membrane right in the middle. It's lined with olfactory receptors, which help to detect smell. It's also lined with mucosa, which are just cells that can secrete mucus. And this mucus helps to moisten the air that's entering our system. It also helps to trap foreign particles that we don't want getting into our lungs. Then, after the air comes in, it moves into the pharynx, which is just the back of the throat, essentially. It's a muscular passage from nasal cavity to the larynx, passageway for both food and air. Then the air moves into the larynx, or the voice box. So it's rigid, made of cartilage, that protrudes anteriorly, so in the front, which makes an Adam's apple, more visible in males than females. It has an epiglottis at the top, which is just a flap of cartilage that helps to separate food and air into appropriate channels. Right? And it's superior to the larynx, so above. Has vocal cords, which can vibrate with expelled air to create sound. And if I move this, you can kind of see here, the epiglottis is right here at the top, so that can cover the windpipe or the trachea when you're swallowing. So the food can go into the esophagus, into the stomach, which is behind the trachea here. You can see a little more clearly here. The vocal cords, they kind of look like an upside down V. And we'll be looking at those when we practice intubations at some point, hopefully. Then we've got the trachea, or the windpipe. So this connects the larynx to the bronchi, or bronchi. It's lined with ciliated mucosa cells. So these are cells that have cilia, those little hairs on top, and secrete mucus. The cilia continuously beats to expel debris away from the lungs, right? Sometimes if you feel like like a little mucusy, right, that's your trachea getting rid of the stuff we don't want. The walls of the trachea, let me move this up, are reinforced with cartilage. That helps to protect that windpipe, right? If you feel, this is your trachea here, if you feel it, it's hard, right? If you got hit, or if someone was trying to choke you, right, it's there to protect your windpipe from completely collapsing easily. It's anterior or in front of the esophagus, so you can't feel your esophagus, it's behind it. At some point, hopefully, when we get back into school, our paramedic will come and teach us how to do intubations, which is pretty cool. It's essentially if someone can't breathe on their own, this is a medical procedure a paramedic or an emergency room technician could do to help get air into the lungs. So it's a tube that you put into the trachea, right? So we want to make sure it goes through those vocal cords into the trachea, not back here into the esophagus, which is over here, right? We don't want to inflate the stomach. We want to inflate the lungs. And then we can put an oxygen bag on top and manually inflate that to force air into the lungs to help someone breathe who's either unconscious or not able to breathe well on their own. All right, so after the trachea, the air moves into the lungs, which occupy most of the thoracic cavity. These are the functioning organs of the system. You don't have to memorize all the different lobes. As the trachea starts to divide into smaller and smaller tubes, those, or tree branches is a good way to think of it. The larger tree branches are called bronchi, or bronchus would be singular. And as they break into smaller and smaller ones, they're called bronchioles. So the large branches are bronchi, the smaller ones are called bronchioles. So we've got the bronchioles here, which are the smaller tree branches. And all the way at the end of every single bronchiole is the functional unit of the lung, which is the alveoli, or alveolus is singular. So the alveolus is the site of gas exchange, right? We're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. It has really thin cells, only one cell thick, that go around the outside, and they're covered with capillaries on the external surface, right? Because we're exchanging, this is where we're exchanging oxygen from the air and carbon dioxide with the blood. We're getting oxygen from the air into the blood, carbon dioxide from the blood into the air so we can exhale. This is kind of a zoomed in version. So we can see this pink here is the cells. Each of these is one cell. So these are the cells of the alveolus. And we've got the capillaries here, which has the blood. And the oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily move across these membranes. They're so small, they can use simple diffusion to move across the membrane. And if you remember anything about simple diffusion from biology class, you remember it's when molecules move from high concentration to low concentration. So let me show you a diagram that might be helpful. So again, gases move across the membrane by diffusion. When we breathe in, there's a high concentration of oxygen in the lungs, in the alveoli, a low concentration in the blood. This is deoxygenated blood that's coming back to the lungs for oxygen. So if there's a high concentration of oxygen inside the lungs, low concentration of oxygen in the blood, the oxygen can simply diffuse across that membrane. So it's moving from high concentration to low concentration in the blood. Carbon dioxide does the exact opposite. We have high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, low concentration in the lungs. So it diffuses from the blood into the lungs. Okay, and if you remember why this is happening, it's all because of cellular respiration, right? Do you remember what cellular respiration is? It's when our body uses oxygen and glucose to make ATP energy. All of our cells, all of our organs need ATP energy to function. So we need to get oxygen to those cells. This is how that happens. So we're getting oxygen in, and if you remember, a byproduct, a waste product of that reaction is carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide gets released into the blood after cellular respiration, and the heart pumps the blood back to the lungs to get reoxygenated. All comes back. All right, another important part of the lungs, there is a mucus called surfactant, which is really important. And pulmonary is just a fancy word for lungs. Anytime you see the prefix pulm or pulmonary, it means lungs. So pulmonary surfactant is a unique mixture of lipids and proteins that covers the entire alveolar surface of the lungs. It reduces surface tension between the air and the mucus in the lungs to prevent airway collapse. You can see this is an alveolus here. It's completely lining that surface. It's a protective layer. It also protects against invading microorganisms from entering the blood, viruses or bacteria. So if you look here, we have a normal alveoli. It looks like a nice big healthy grapes almost, a bunch of grapes. And if they're collapsed, they're going to look something like this, like squished grapes. They're not going to function very well, if at all, if they're collapsed. So this can happen if there's no surfactant. And actually with COVID-19, this is what happens in people's lungs, which causes them not to breathe. COVID-19 causes the body to not produce enough surfactant. So this can happen to the lungs, unfortunately, which is what causes that shortness of breath symptom. If you want to pause this and look more closely at surface tension with and without surfactant, feel free. I'm going to keep moving to functions of the respiratory system. So there are two very important functions. First of all, it's the site of gas exchange, like I already talked about, between the blood and the external environment. We need to get oxygen in. We also really need to get carbon dioxide out. The passageways to the lungs are also purified, warmed, and humidified before they enter the lungs, right? That's what that mucous membrane, those mucus cells, the surfactant, and the ciliated cells, those little hairs. They get all the yucky stuff out. They warm the air before it gets into our lungs. Let's talk about pulmonary ventilation. So the actual mechanism of breathing. Inhalation is a very active process that requires energy. The diaphragm, remember that muscle right here under the lungs, contracts, flattens out, and actually causes free space in the lungs, which kind of acts like a vacuum and forces air in. Right? It's dropping that thoracic pressure, the pressure inside the lungs, again, like a vacuum forcing the air in. Exhalation is a passive process where air is just forced out of the lungs because that diaphragm relaxes. So it relaxes, just kind of like if you were like squeezing on a balloon, right? That would just force the air out. Kind of same thing is happening here. We're just forcing the air out. Here's another, just a nice diagram that I like. We've got the lungs here. You can see the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli at the end. A nice zoomed in alveoli covered in capillaries. And then here we can see the site of gas exchange, right? Oxygen moving in, carbon dioxide moving out. And lastly, I just want to quickly talk about intrapulmonary pressure, right? Intra means inside, pulmonary means lungs. So this is the pressure inside the lungs, and that's what keeps your lungs inflated. So normally, this pressure is slightly less than atmospheric pressure, which is called negative pressure. And when the pleural cavity is damaged and the intrapleural pressure becomes equal or exceeds the atmospheric pressure, this can happen here. This is called a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung. And this is what it would look like on an x-ray, right? Empty space in an x-ray looks black. So you can see the lung has shrunk down to this little tiny space here. Okay, so this could happen with a gunshot wound, with a stab wound, if somebody broke a rib and the rib bone actually punctured the lung space. This is something that can happen. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful and you took some good notes. If you need to pause or rewind and go back, go for it. And I'll see you in class. Bye-bye.